February the 9th, 2022, and well, a lot of the major topics I normally discuss on here, like the ongoing Ukraine crisis and a lot of our domestic politics are still brewing. Nothing really too big that stands out among the rest is happening right now. So I'm going to address another subject that I haven't had a chance to get back to in a while, is the so-called unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAP subject. And I thought I'd kind of do some things that have come out lately on that, and just to kind of give some perspective on it. First of all, what kind of triggered this right now is two things. One, Christopher Mellon has published a fairly lengthy article in which he basically is raising the issue with last summer's report, the UAP report, which, if we recall, studied 144 cases within the Navy from 2004 until the period of, I guess, 2020 or 2019 or something like that. And basically, they were all Navy cases. And they were only able to actually identify one out of the 144 definitively as a very prosaic object. I think it was a balloon or something. So the rest of them are listed in the unidentified category. But Christopher Mellon, who, remember, is the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence under both the Clinton and under the Bush W administrations in that transition period around the turn of the century, has been a main mover in that. And his article points out that the lack of Air Force cases in this study is rather significant because the Air Force has the most profound set of sensors that could detect these things. After all, the Air Force, and now, of course, now the Space Command, which has been spun off from the Air Force, but at the time that report was dealing, it was still, the Space Force is now, largely the old Air Force Space Command, plus a few elements of Navy and other services that, had some similar capabilities, but it's mostly Air Force. Space Command has now become a separate service, just like the Air Force used to be part of the Army years ago, a long time ago, before all of our times. So, at any rate, the point I'm making is that the lack of these Air Force cases is rather significant, given the number of airplanes the Air Force flies, more than the Navy, and all the sensors, the satellites, the radars. I mean, they have an extensive set of sensor systems. In this article, Christopher Mellon goes through what all these are at an unclassified level, of course, and points out how absurd it is that they didn't have a single case. And he basically is strongly hinting that it's a cover-up, basically. By the way, if you like these videos, please give me a like. If you haven't subscribed, please do. And you can forward these to anybody else that would be interested. Comments appreciated. So back to the message here. So essentially, that's essentially his point, and I thought it was rather strong. I'll put a link to the article in the description below. It's a lengthy article. I don't suppose most of you would care to go through all of it unless you're very interested in the subject. It takes a while to read, but the gist of it is he goes through all the different kinds of sensors that the Air Force had, and now I guess a lot of them are also part of the Space Force. But the point is, they didn't report any of those cases, and that's incredibly incredible, right? And he also points out there's evidence that the Air Force OSI is trying to crack down on Air Force personnel they're chatting about on Air Force, interior message boards and stuff. I guess they exist within the secure world that's not available to the public, where they can communicate with each other. And apparently this has aroused the attention of the Air Force OSI, which seems to be one of the prime movers in the whole UFO information management program, let's call it. At any rate, I thought that was an interesting article, and it's very notable considering, and he's been one of the main people working with the congressional committees to get this law passed to set up a special office in the DOD to study these phenomena. This brings me to another question, which I'll also put a link to. I just, over the weekend, watched a video it had Nick Pope and Michael Shermer. And Michael Shermer is the president, or whatever the title is, the leader of the Skeptic Society. and I think he's on a website called skeptic.com or something like that. I'll put a link to that video there too. And Nick Pope is the person who at one time in the British world, you may have seen him if you're interested in this subject at all on various programs, both the History Channel Ancient Aliens thing, but also in other programs. He seems to be brought in as kind of a UFO expert who has a more neutral point of view. And he used to be the person who had the UFO desk, or UAP desk, as the British called it. And I guess we're calling it now too. Back in I think it was the 1990s, early 2000, around 2010. Sorry, I always think back further when I was younger, right? And they around 2010, I guess it would have been. Well, no, it was 1990s, I think. I'm getting confused on the date, but the point is, he investigated the famous, Rendlesham Forest case, anyhow, and that was one of the famous cases where the U.S. Air Force personnel went out to see these lights, and it caused a disturbance that the vice commander of this Air Force wing of F-111s went out along with him with his tape recorder. And there's a recording of what they were experiencing as they approached this object that landed. And it led to, if somehow this got leaked, actually, but somebody was planning to play a practical joke on the colonel, actually, I believe, and got into the media. This was why it didn't get totally suppressed and became a famous UFO incident. At any rate, he did a review of that years later when he had this desk. And after he retired from the defense ministry, he's become kind of let's give him some cred to be a UFO expert, and he represents it from kind of what you might call an agnostic point of view. That is, he's neither a believer nor an unbeliever. At any rate, and Shermer, I guess, being from the Skeptic Society, I guess is coming in more from the skeptical point of view, although he wasn't in a full-scale debunking mode in this video either. So that was interesting just to hear how they're discussing this thing, and there's so much that even these people seem to kind of miss. And they were discussing, well, there's these 3 videos that Lou Elizondo managed to get get declassified and put out of the Pentagon somehow or another. And I guess the trick was he got them reduced to the level of unclassified official use only, and then resigned. Well, I think the punishment for releasing for official use only is probably disciplinary, like being fired or demoted or given some kind of a punishment. I don't think it's criminal prosecution. Now, where if it was classified, it would be a major federal offense, and you're talking prison. So I believe that's the case. At any rate, they got out, and there's been no real blowback on it to speak of, and it's a little bit ambiguous who released them and how that goes. But I think Mellon may have been the one that actually put them out, and maybe Mellon still had a security clearance so he could actually see them, or who knows. At any rate, they got out, and eventually, after 2 years, the DoD admitted that they were authentic. That is to say that they were real Defense Department photos, videos, but they're not saying what they were. They're just of some unknown observation. And I just thought it was sort of interesting to see how they handle this, and they're saying, well, if you debunk these, they were raising an issue, if you debunk these 3 videos, has the whole thing gone away, is too much being banked on this? And I'm thinking, when you really look at this subject, I mean, it goes way back before 2004. I mean, it goes back to the World War II period at least, probably before. But it became notorious with the Foo Fighters of World War II. There was so-called ghost rocket incidents right after World War II in the Norway and Swedish areas, and then of course 47, the beginning of the modern UFO era. Where the term flying saucer was coined, and where the famous, of course, Roswell incident and other things that occurred throughout that whole period. I mean, when you talk about things like the triangular UFOs and stuff, I mean, you have to go back to, well, the Hudson Valley cases in the mid-1980s, the Belgian cases with the Belgian Air Force in the late 80s, and that period, 89, 90, that period, and so forth. And there's many other incidents. So in other words, this is far more widespread than is being sort of recruited to 3 incidents. And that's what I think people need to focus on, so that they were still playing with this theory that oh, could they be Chinese or Russian drones? Well, first of all, and then they're saying, well, maybe we don't really have the performance data that's been claimed for them. Maybe that's over exaggerated. Although it still is an interesting question, and of course we have the idea that one of them might have just been a bird. Okay, I got that one. But you get into that whole issue that regardless of what those three things are, those are mainly important because they broke the issue public, not because they're necessarily the best cases that exist. I mean, Elizondo, who's the other one in that group, as you know, points out there are other cases that are in the classified world, and apparently they're classified largely because of the sensor systems that are detected on. And that are much better than these. So that, and there are other instances. So what you can't dismiss the thing based on the foibles of these three videos. Really, it's a much bigger issue, and it's been around a lot longer. And which also raises the issue of the fact that the Air Force presented no cases, right? And so that leads us to believe that the Air Force probably knows a whole lot more about it than they're letting on. That may be where a lot of the real knowledge that the U.S. government has is located, and other parts are probably somewhere within the intelligence community. We think maybe CIA or NSA or whatever. I mean, after all, Elizondo was in the DIA, which is also part of that community and was cleared, top secret SCI, and so we don't know. It is a real interesting question what the real truth really is. But we get the feeling there's a lot of reluctance to bring out whatever that is. I mean, we kind of get that, don't we? So anyhow, I just thought these would be two interesting things, and I'll put links to them. But I just thought it was interesting how they're discussing it from this point of view that could possibly be Russian or Chinese vehicles. But the question is, in 2004, I mean, the Chinese weren't really that advanced in 2004 like they are now. They came along a long ways in the past 18 years, And then if you go beyond that, what could the Chinese possibly have been doing in 1947? I mean, you see what I'm saying? And that we could be that far behind Russia for that long doesn't pass the smell test, since it was pretty clear that we were technologically advanced above Russia for the most part. During that period, there was that little glitch where they got ahead of us in missiles for a brief period of time, where we then rapidly caught up. But remember, that's because we had invested tremendously in manned aircraft as part of our strategic forces in the 1950s, and the Russians, facing the U.S. Air Force capabilities, decided to be able to leap over us, I guess you'd say, by building ICBMs, and so they put a lot of effort into big ICBMs that could carry very large bombs while we worked on miniaturizing the bombs. And so, by the later years, the two technologies converged, but at the time, the U.S. was ahead in miniaturizing bombs and was not as worried about being able to deliver weapons anyhow, where the Russians were. So they put a lot of money into ICBMs. And, but that's probably a few examples where they actually had a technological edge. They may also get ahead in certain areas that we just don't emphasize as much because maybe we didn't need them, and they saw a clear need in their program. So I still get back to the basic line. There's just no way these things are foreign technology, Earth-based foreign technology. You either have to explain them away as they really don't exist other than as some kind of a phenomenon that is misunderstood completely, or there's some kind of vehicles from elsewhere. And I don't see other way around it. But, at any rate, it was an interesting discussion, and I thought it was interesting to sit back and listen to what the skeptics had to say for a period of time. Although I don't consider Nick Pope a hard skeptic. He's kind of in a neutral category. And perhaps, I always say that I think that the main issue on why the people such as Mellon and Elizondo were focusing on the threat idea for a long time was as a way to get the government interested again. Because if it was a Russian or Chinese technology messing around in our training areas and observing all of our capabilities, that would be a serious intelligence threat at a minimum. and therefore we should be concerned about it. And that itself kind of proves these are in the other category. If it really was possibly something like that, the government would be reacting to it and not just trying to hide it. And they would be making a major issue out of it, obviously. And since they're not, they know that it's not that. Anyway, I'll close this for now. The addresses of my social media are below, along with the links I talked about. And this will be all for today. Until next time.